Pinnacle Peak Recovery presents Facing Addiction Podcast.
We have a whole generation that we've lost to fentanyl. Just last year, 100,000 people.
You know, even though I didn't want to believe that it was happening or
to respond in healthier ways so that we could give them the best chance that we could.
Hey guys, welcome to the Facing Addiction Podcast. My name's Tyler Tisdale. I'm the founder and CEO of Pinnacle Peak Recovery. This season on the podcast, we're focusing on boundaries and harm reduction and where those two can meet. This episode, I have a very special guest. It's my own mom, Lisa Tisdale. Very excited to have you here.
Thank you, Tyler. I'm excited to be here.
Why don't we just start off by telling the listeners a little bit about you and what you did for a career and just kind of your backstory.
You know, I've been a nurse, a registered nurse for many years, and my career was focused primarily on intensive care, and then I moved into more of an administrative role for a large healthcare company in Northern California.
So growing up, I've told my story before that I grew up and my dad was an alcoholic and my brother struggled with addiction. So you were kind of around this while I was growing up early on. You guys divorced when I was 5. He kind of took off. And so what was going on at that time, like from your perspective? And I just kind of want to give a background because it'll give more context on kind of what you were facing while we were growing up.
You know, a lot of this I haven't thought about for a long time, quite honestly.
Yeah.
And so now that you're kind of mentioning some of the things you remembered, you're right. You know, your dad was arrested or DUIs.
Yeah, DUIs.
At least 2, maybe even 3 times. Definitely twice when I was with him. And I remember the first time I was very much like an enabler, you know, trying to, you know, cover up at his work. You know, I didn't talk to any of my friends or my peers about it. It was just like in denial, like, oh, you know, he got arrested. And then, you know, he was arrested again. And I remember that second time, I didn't even know where he was. He was arrested. He was like off the grid. And that, I believe, for me was a turning point. Like, you know, once, okay, but learn from that. Okay, I've got a problem, or, you know, pivot, you know, but don't keep going down that path. And he kept going down that path, and I didn't like being on the other end of that, you know, because I had no idea where he was. Turns out he's in jail, you know, and that's not where my life was going. You know, at that point I was pursuing, you know, my nursing degree, and I had, you know, longer term goals that I wanted to achieve. And it was going to be difficult to do that with someone who was really, you know, kind of destroying their life. You know, that's the way I saw it.
Then you met Bob, and around that time, Sean was struggling in middle school, and I was still pretty young at this point, so I wasn't really getting into any trouble. But what happened then when Sean, my brother, started going off to the races?
I went to Al-Anon, and you know, I specifically focused on Al-Anon for parents of, you know, kids, because he was an adolescent.
Right.
He was, you know, under 18. So at that point, you know, I felt like I needed to try to do whatever I could while I, you know, to provide the resources and for him as well as myself while he was under 18. Because, you know, after you're 8, I've thought in my head, you know, that after he's 18, he's on his own. Like, and so I definitely went to Al-Anon. I, you know, heard other parents talking about boundaries, and setting it's not okay. Like, for example, some boundaries in our household. It's not okay if you're under 21 to be drinking and
Mm-hmm.
using drugs and, having pretty aggressive, violent outbursts, because that's what his behavior became.
He was under 18, so you had this, in your eyes, an opportunity to really give him the resources while he was still in the house, and you were learning boundaries and you were setting boundaries: no drinking under 21, no drug use, I'm assuming, and other things. But what was the boundary?
So there were boundaries, like the car was taken away. Like,
Mhm.
you're no longer going to have access to any of the family vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
So no cars.
Mm-hmm.
He needed to be home at a certain time, and if he wasn't, the door was locked and
Mm-hmm.
he was out for the
Mm-hmm.
night.
Mm-hmm. How hard
Um,
was that
That
as a mom?
Oh, it was very hard. It was very difficult for me because I think a big part of it was I had, expectations for both you and your brother, right?
Yeah.
Like going to college,
Yeah.
doing this, becoming whatever, I had in my head. And so I kind of felt like all that was unraveling.
Mm-hmm.
And that was difficult to accept, that I had to let go of my own expectations of my kids,
Mm-hmm.
and then having to be like, the tough love, because that was kind of some of the terminology back then. I don't even know if they still say that, but in
Mhm.
Al-Anon it was like tough love. You can't enable that kind of behavior. And I remember kind of, putting on my brass armor and having to really act the role of
Yeah.
being a tough, parent, drawing a line in the sand, which is not my nature. I
Mhm.
want to be a caretaker. I want to be,
Mhm.
someone who loves and supports and, kind of coddles my kids, and
Yeah.
and so that was difficult.
Well, I think that's the mother's instinct too. And I think
Mhm.
when we talk about boundaries, it really goes against parents and really a lot of people who aren't really informed with addiction. It goes against their natural instincts, and they're like, "What?"
Yeah, and that's I remember one of the counselors saying, and it stuck in my head, that as a parent, you wouldn't take away an opportunity for your kid to learn some kind of life lesson,
Mm-hmm.
would you?
Mm-hmm.
And,
Mm-hmm.
and in a way, if what I took away from that was, if I continued to enable that kind of behavior, then there wouldn't be the consequences for, you using,
Mm-hmm.
drinking,
Mm-hmm.
acting out.
Mhm.
He or you would never, experience the downside.
And you still loved us no matter what, and you always were supportive and
Mhm.
like, "Hey, I'm here to help for your recovery."
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Right. And the message was always, I love you, I support you,
Mm-hmm.
but what you're doing now, I can't support.
I remember. Yeah. Now that you say
Mhm.
that, I remember that clear as day. And
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I don't think I'd be where I am today if it wasn't for that stuff. So.
I think my experience with you may have been different, in the sense that I continued to be in a lot of denial,
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, this can't be happening again.
Mm-hmm.
And it was harder in some ways for me to accept that you were using or whatever you were into at that point, because your behavior was not as out there like your brother.
Well, yeah. And so backing up, Bob had 3 kids of his own around our age. I was the youngest. We ended up moving in with each other, and we all were using in this house. And that's when I started using and drinking. And I just can't imagine how tough that was for you and Bob.
Yeah, quite honestly, it was a shit show. I don't know if you
Yeah.
could really say that on the podcast, but
You
it
can.
was, blending family was way more than I had no idea how difficult it was going to be for not only Bob and I as a couple to maintain our relationship, but then, in retrospect, how difficult it must have been for all of you kids too, trying to, merge these families together, and then layer on top of that, substance use.
Mm-hmm.
And, at some points it was like all 5 kids was like a pack going after Bob and I, like a pack of wolves. Like it is like, they would gang up on us if if we were trying to enforce something, or it was
How tough is that?
it was like, oh my gosh. And I remember Bob just saying, just remember, at some point they're all going to be gone, launched, and it'll just be you and I, and we'll be able to carry on with our relationship. But it was very challenging. And the other thing was that Bob's philosophy of parenting and my philosophy of parenting, were not completely aligned.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were gaps in that
In
the
what ways?
kids
Can you just give us some like high level differences?
Well, I had no problem going in like bedrooms.
Okay.
Like it's my house.
Uh-huh.
If I think there's something going on in there that shouldn't be going on in there, I'm going to go in there and check it out.
Mm-hmm.
And then Bob had a philosophy of, the kids' room is their room, and you don't go in there. Now, granted, when I went in some of the rooms, like you and your brothers, there was like alcohol stuffed under the beds and, pot and things. So, I think at that point, that's when it shifted, like, okay, Bob's like going to go in there.
And so I started using more heavily in early on in high school. And I remember finding a Vicodin prescription in Bob's cabinet, and I took a Vicodin or 2. I called in sick from school. That was my thing. I wouldn't really ditch school, but early on, maybe I did later, but early on, I just call out sick. And so I was out sick. I found the Vicodin. I took 2 Vicodin. I remember telling myself, all right, I'm going to take 2 and I'm not going to take any more because I'll get caught. So I took 2. I really liked the effect from Vicodin. The next day I called out sick again, and I was like powerless over this. And I remember being back there the next day, and I told myself, all right, I'm just going to do it this time, and I'm not going to do it anymore. And then the next day I was back the next day. And that was the first time I experienced a physical allergy, which is outlined in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, of this abnormal reaction to drugs and alcohol. Normal people don't take Vicodin and then can't control themselves the next day to go get it. And a lot of people say, well, it's just a choice, like you're weak-willed. But it's like your brain is hijacked. Next thing I know, I'm in the medicine cabinet taking it. I remember you guys called an emergency meeting, and it was like, hey, who took these Vicodin? All of them were gone shortly thereafter. Who took all these Vicodin? Like, we're not necessarily mad. We're more just worried, because that was a lot of Vicodin. And I remember just kind of like laying low, and no one had any idea that it was me. That's kind of was my role. I was like the innocent one. And then I started getting in more trouble with like check fraud and stealing. And I remember just my phone ringing, and it was you, and my heart would drop because I knew I was in trouble, and you guys caught me stealing another check. I stole credit cards, money, coins out of the quarter box. Got boundaries were enforced. I would break back in the house to steal more. I was just in full active addiction and very selfish.
Yeah, and I think early on, like I mentioned before, I was in so much denial that it was you. Like, I'm like, no, it's got to be with somebody else. It's one of the other kids. They're lying. and that was just my own coping mechanism kicking in. Like, I didn't want to believe it. When I snapped out of my denial was when you had called in sick from school again, or you were sick from school.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, okay, if you're sick, let's go to the doctor. Let's go, because obviously something's wrong with you that,
remember this, yeah.
so let's go to the doctor. And, they did the urine, the blood, everything. And the urine or blood, drug screen came back with, it was like a whole bunch of chemicals in there, not just like marijuana, not like THC. It was like all kinds of things.
Well, I was taking ecstasy at the time and doing coke, so it probably just ecstasy has a whole bunch of stuff in it. So it was probably like amphetamine, MDMA, coke. Yeah, I remember that.
And I'm like, holy cow. Okay, we got a problem here. And that was a huge wake-up call for me. And here we go again.
So what did you do?
So that was, I believe, rehab stint number 1, outpatient. I remember them doing a drug screen, and that's when the Oxycontin came up, or you tested positive for that. And I remember the counselor asking me, have you ever heard of Oxycontin? And I was like, no. Well, and she started to explain, that this is kind of an up and coming, epidemic, and that you tested positive. And I believe at that point, then it was a recommendation you go to more of a residential, the camp
recovery center. I was 16.
Yeah. So you went to that. And I just remember being relieved that there was some way to kind of pluck you out of the environment to hopefully, remove you from the environment, because the outpatient just wasn't, that just wasn't working. And I trust the professionals, they were recommending this, and I'm like, yeah, let's do it.
Sure. Yeah. Tried running away, and we could just kind of speed up on this, but
the running away. Let me just say one thing about the
running. Yeah, I was a runner.
You were a runner. And again, I'm laughing about this now, but it was not funny. That we were on the way to a second inpatient program somewhere
it was in San Mateo
on the peninsula. Yeah. And we stopped at, we got off the highway on an exit, stopped, and you opened the door of the car and took off.
Yep.
In the middle of, I don't even know what city we were in, just took off.
Can you imagine being behind us in a car? What the heck?
And I remember, I think Bob was with me. We were just like, okay. Now what?
How
now
hard,
what?
I just can't imagine how overwhelmed I would feel.
And I think we called the rehab and just said, we're not going to make it. And he took off. And somehow you ended up back there.
Well, I think the cops found me.
Maybe the cops, the cops found you.
And this was after I had gotten arrested for check fraud. So I'd kind of gone off the deep end here at 16. I was causing a lot of wreckage. I was stealing from you guys. I was lying, manipulative. I was stealing from friends. I was stealing I was just trying to support my drug use, which isn't, an excuse for the behavior, but it's an explanation. I'm not a bad person. I was just in active addiction and desperate to fuel my drug habit. And so I got arrested. The judge said, if you go to this program, we'll drop the charges. And we're on our way. And I jumped out the car. I took off. They found me in a parking lot. I went to the program. And then 2 weeks later, you guys were in Hawaii. And I'll let you finish the story.
Yeah, I still may have a little resentment about this one. That we were in Hawaii with my parents, and my brother was at home, still in
the Bay Area.
Right? And I got a call from the rehab center saying that you took off, you left. And so I asked my brother, I was concerned that you were going to head over to our house
Mm-hmm.
and steal
Mm-hmm.
or who knows what. But
Yeah.
I was thinking you were probably going to break in the house to either sleep there, eat there, or steal something.
Mm-hmm.
And so I sent my brother over to our house, asked him to go check on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe you had already broken a window
Mm-hmm.
to break into the house,
Mhm.
and you were actually there when he got there, and
Mhm.
he confronted you. You were opening your Christmas present, and which I
Oh, was I?
yeah, you had opened your Christmas present, which was like a shirt, or some new clothes. Because I
Man.
remember him telling me that you were like taking the new clothes.
Uh-huh.
And after that, I'm not sure what happened, but yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what happened.
Smashed the window to break into our house.
Yeah, and I just can't imagine how.
And then I flew home. What I did, which I guess I thought it was the best thing to do at the time, most likely to protect, the reason would be to protect our property.
The home, yeah.
Was I flew home
Mm-hmm.
and left everybody in Hawaii and flew home before the end of our vacation.
Yeah.
That was the last straw.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I've ever told you this. I mean, I've made amends, but I'm so sorry that I stole the time that you had on that trip.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's not like I'm a bad person or
No.
we're bad people in addiction. It's just like we're just
Out.
you lose control. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just cause a lot of wreckage, and our job in recovery is to do the best we can to clean it up. But yeah, I can't give you that back. So now we're kind of setting the stage on what life was like for my mom, Lisa, and how you dealt with that and what type of boundaries you laid out for me. And so I remember not being allowed at the house, and I was sleeping in the boat, the side yard.
Mm-hmm.
Understandably so, because what was I doing? I was running away from rehabs. When I was in town, I was breaking into the house. If I was living at the house, I was stealing from you guys. So it's like, what do you do? So I'm living on this side of the house. I remember it was around Christmas time, and it was not my problem. It was everybody else's fault. And I was walking down the street in Livermore, and I was wearing carpet slippers, and it was raining outside and my feet were soaking wet. And I called my friend. I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, it's Christmas time. I'm hanging out with my family. And at that point I felt so alone and so like depressed. And I just didn't know it was addiction. My dad was an alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
I saw my brother going crazy with drugs, and it's not like, that's how delusional. It's just crazy looking back and thinking you could be in such delusion when that was like kind of my life. And so I remember getting a call shortly after Christmas. It was shortly after New Year's. It's, hey, Tyler, if you want to come back to the house, you could stay here for the night or a couple nights. And I went back. So if you could kind of back up and kind of tell your side of the story on where you were leading up to this.
Yeah. So you had been out in, you're right, like not at home or living in the boat, under the boat cover.
Did you know I was living under the boat cover?
I didn't really know you were living under the boat cover, but I thought you were staying with friends. So
Okay.
I reached out to a couple of your friends and
like Claire, I remember.
and just asked them. I said, Tyler needs help and I'm really worried about him. And by you guys helping him, if you're giving him money or places to stay, that's really not helping him.
Mm-hmm.
If you could please ask him just to come home.
Yeah.
Just come home and we'll figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the background before you came home, I had been planning basically an intervention, having someone come and, if and when you came home someone come and pick you up in the middle of the night.
Mm-hmm.
And I had, already gone up to visit a therapeutic boarding school
Mm-hmm. Where at?
in Idaho.
Okay, you already visited it at that point.
Yeah, I had
Okay.
already visited it. I'd done a bunch of research
Mm-hmm.
and decided that, I had arranged with the interventionist, I had arranged a wilderness wilderness program
Mm-hmm.
that was in Utah.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, would
Mhm.
go to the therapeutic boarding school. So I had this plan, but I needed you to be home.
Yeah.
And so fortunately, you came home. And that first night, I let the interventionist know that you were there.
Uh-huh.
And they came at, like 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning.
Uh-huh.
And they're like two professionals,
Mhm.
basically they came and, I was in the background. They basically said, this is the plan.
We're going camping.
We're
That's what they told me.
You're going camping
for a couple weeks.
You're going camping, and you can either make it easy or hard. Is
Yeah.
basically, I think, the message.
Mhm.
And that got you on a plane and flew to Utah
Yep.
in the winter.
Mhm.
And so it was cold. It was like I don't even know how many weeks, a few weeks out there, a couple weeks maybe.
It was like 4 or 5.
Yeah. And, it was just really, again, out of desperation because I was afraid. I mean, my fear was you're going to die.
Yeah. I get to Utah. I remember landing, going to the doctor, getting a physical, and I tried to manipulate the doctor for drugs. They were not having it. Obviously, I get in the car with people who work for the company, and they drive me out to the middle of nowhere. And on that drive, I remember them saying, "How could you ever end up here? You are such a nice kid." And that was kind of like the premise of me in addiction, was like just like putting on this mask or face that, like, oh, I'm just such an innocent kid. And then so then I'm 2 weeks in, or like a week into wilderness. And at this point, as you guys have heard, I've ran away a few times. I'm going to the bathroom in a tree, and you're supposed to yell your name like, Tyler, Tyler. And I run. And I'm in the middle of nowhere. My plan is I'm going to run to my dad in Idaho. And at this point, I didn't really have a relationship with my dad. He hasn't been around, but he was in active alcoholism, and he was an enabler. And so I knew if I can get to him, I'd be okay. So I ran, and they caught me with dogs, and I started throwing rocks at them. And I was thinking I'd rather be back in juvenile hall than this place. And I'm throwing rocks at them. The same people who escorted me out there that said, "You're such a nice kid," picked me up. And they were like, okay, now I see what is going on. And so, yeah, I was in there for 4 weeks. And then I got, then I broke the news. I was talking with you and Dad on a satellite phone, and you guys were like kind of connected on the same page with this. And I remember kind of like knowing that. And then I got transferred over to the boarding school and found out that I was going to the boarding school, which was a 12-step boarding school.
And you ran away from there too.
Yeah, I ran away from there, and they were worried the bucks were going to get me.
No, the moose.
The moose.
The moose are dangerous. Don't worry about the bear.
Yeah.
It's the moose.
So they followed my tracks in the snow, found me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, you've graduated. You got your high school diploma from that school.
Yeah.
And then you came back and you went out again. At that point, you were 18, I think, or close to it. So,
well, I graduated high school, and I turned 18, and they talked me into staying up there in a sober living. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll do that. And then we ended up relapsing up there, and I was kicked out, and I went back and lived with Sean, my older brother.
I had to start thinking about myself. Like, you were making choices, and, even though I didn't want to believe that it was happening, or, that you were in active addiction, and, and I tried to do the things that I felt would give you the resources to change the direction you were going. But the other important thing for me about setting boundaries was that was important for me to stay healthy. That because to have that kind of chaos in my life let's say I didn't set those boundaries and I allowed you to stay at the house
And steal.
and continue to steal and,
Yeah.
make ATM withdrawal, I mean, that would take an emotional toll on me. And I, at some point, really needed to start taking care of myself. And that's what, a big part of boundaries is also.
Yeah.
It's not only to not enable
Mm-hmm.
the active, loved one, but to, you got to take care of yourself, or else you're going to get gobbled up by this disease too.
Yeah. And we just had the CEO of PAL on the podcast, and he talked about how a father who was in healthy condition died of a heart attack from the stress, and the doctor said it was from the stress. And I remember talking with Bob recently, like over the last few years, and he was sharing a little bit about your state when this was all going on, and it sounded like it was just causing a ton of emotional distress on you, and you were unhappy and just really like depressed.
Sad, depressed. Yeah, it was really difficult. Really difficult. It was the fear that my kid was going to die or was not going to be a part of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really sad for me because I love you. I love I love
you too. I can't, now that I have kids, I just can't imagine.
Yeah. And, it was a rocky part of my life. And, I'm just so grateful that our story turned out the way it did.
Yeah.
Because
it's a happy ending.
It's a happy ending because it could have gone either way, really.
Oh, for sure. Well, so what ended up happening? Let's just go to the end of the addiction, active addiction. What ended up happening?
Well, you were out and about. I don't know all the shenanigans you were up to, but I remember talking to Bob, like, either I'm going to get a phone call, he's dead, or get a phone call, he's in jail. And I mean, thank God I got a phone call. You were in jail down here in Maricopa County, right?
Phoenix, Arizona.
Or Phoenix, Arizona. And
what was your thought when you heard that?
I was like, where the hell is Maricopa? It was like Maricopa, the sheriff or something.
Yeah.
And, on many levels, I was relieved that it wasn't a phone call that you were dead. I mean, that's the truth.
Yeah.
And I was just like, well, thank God he's in jail.
That's not an uncommon story or feeling.
Yeah.
So you were like, what the heck is he doing out there?
Yeah. I was like, I don't know what he was doing there, but thank God, he's what I perceived as a safer place. I have no idea if jail's safer or not, but
I think it is than where I was. Yeah.
And the rest is, really your story to tell because, it's just a incredible story, how you turned your life completely around.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. So I was in jail for 5 months and then I got out, and I remember the guy who 12-stepped me, who was bringing meetings into jail, suggested that I stay out here because I was going to get probation transferred back there. And I don't really remember the dialogue between us, but I think it was like, well, you need to go into sober living. I think that was the plan or something like that. And then he's like, you should stay out here. Where's your ideas got any in the past? I'm like, no, we're good. So I stayed out here, and you helped me with sober living for the first few months. And that's not enabling. And I think parents kind of get confused on what's helping and enabling. And I think a very easy way to know what helping and enabling is drawing the line for recovery. Like, is this promoting recovery? And that's helping. Like getting someone into treatment, sober living, that's not enabling, that's helping. So luckily, you guys were able to help me with sober living. And I got a job, and my first sponsor told me, we're fully self-supporting. And that's an AA tradition. You got to be fully self-supporting. So that's what I was taught. And I grew up in AA and 12 steps from 24 on. I grew up. And at that point, prior to that, I'd always been reliant on you. And I remember, and when the boundaries were up, you know, that was another thing. But when they weren't, I was always relying on you. And I remember you kind of painted the picture or you explained it as cutting the umbilical cord with the boundaries. And that, honestly, all of those boundaries and all of that life experience, like I would not be sober today without it. If I got into active addiction at 24 and I didn't have the support and love from you guys and the boundaries and the quote unquote tough love, which I don't really remember it being tough. I just remember there being firm boundaries. Like I'm, you know, and without that, I would not be in recovery today. And life has just been absolutely beautiful in recovery. And if you don't mind, just sharing a little bit about your experience on how this has come full circle.
Yeah. So I think I'm currently, in working the 12 steps, and that didn't start until, later in my life. And I'm super grateful that I've been able to find this program of recovery. And who knows why, I chose to let alcohol really take over my life. I think it was a combination of not taking care of myself early on. Honestly, a lot of that experience with my children, it was substance abuse was a form. I mean, I really think it was traumatic,
Oh, it's
because
definitely trauma.
I had that fear for many years that they were going to not be around. And the way I dealt with it, like I mentioned earlier, was I was a workaholic. I went to school. I had, multiple jobs. I never dealt with my emotions, and then when I retired, and at the end of my career and when I retired, then I'm like, okay, now what? And with COVID then layered on top of that, I just had a lot of, time, and basically I wasn't healthy emotionally, spiritually, and, finally had to raise my hand like, hey, I need help. And, like I said, I'm just very grateful that I've found the support in the program, the 12-step program, working with a sponsor. And, it's not easy for me to talk about or to admit, because I never identified as, someone with an alcohol, an alcoholic. But, here I am. And it's been over a year, about a year and a half, that I haven't had any alcohol, and my life is beautiful. I love it. And I'm just so proud of, Sean, and my older son's in recovery. Now I'm going to cry.
Yeah.
Sean's in recovery, Tyler's in recovery, and just couldn't be prouder,
Yeah. It's so, it's such a beautiful story with so much like pain and tragedy along the way. But it couldn't have been a better ending. And I think that's really cool what you just said about like the distraction of the trauma through work. And then when you retired and COVID hit, it's like you didn't really have anything to distract yourself. And so alcohol became that distraction. I think definitely the trauma makes a lot of sense. And yeah, Sean and I, my older brother, we ended up going to rehab together right before I got arrested in Arizona. And Sean stayed sober, and then I think he had a relapse. He went back to that rehab, and he's been sober since. And my brother has done a medication assisted treatment path, and I've done a different path. And you have a similar path as me, but I'm sure it's like a little different. And I just think the beautiful thing about recovery is like there's different paths, and whatever works for you. But I could tell you that all three of us now in recovery, it's like it's a beautiful thing, and I'm just grateful. Like I don't care what path you guys take. It's just really cool that we have a relationship now, and like we're all like really supportive of one another.
Yeah, I love that too. And I love the fact that we can really, I think I feel like we've been able to start having deeper conversations and like really connecting on a deeper level instead of kind of being, high level.
Yeah.
And I love that.
I love you. Thank you for always having my back and supporting me and planting all those seeds along the way. And yeah, I just appreciate you so much.
Well, I love you too. And I'm so proud of you.
Yeah, thank you.